And joining me today are the documentary filmmakers Marc Serpa Francoeur and Robinder Uppal. They are documentary filmmakers originally from Calgary and whose work focuses on diversity, immigration, and social justice. Robinder and Marc, thank you for being here with me today.
Thanks for having us, Michael.
Thank you so much.
So my first question is kind of a general question that I like to ask documentarians. As documentarians, how do you settle on a subject? What is it that makes one story over another, that thing that clicks and that you want to invest time and years into investigating and documenting?
I don't know that there's any one answer. I think that, I think with most of our films, there's been some sort of personal connection, either related to place or, for example, when we did the World in 10 Blocks, this project about immigrant small business owners in Toronto, this is the neighborhood we lived in. It was very sort of intimate in that respect for us. With this film, obviously, this is, Calgary is where we were born and raised. This is a story where I think everyone's watched the film at this point. It was really through Godfred's story. We had been introduced to him by his then defense attorney, and it just, it took us a number of years to sort of figure out what we wanted to do with the film more broadly. But I think this was sort of a kind of right place in time. We saw that there was, starting with his story, a very powerful and important and disturbing story that needed to be told. And that really pushed us to look sort of more broadly at what was going on with police in the city, and then with the accountability mechanisms in the province. And, I think it was something that seemed to us it's something that needed to be told, and nobody else. It wasn't like there was, a whole bunch of different people clamoring to tell this story. So it really felt like a right place at the right time. And those are some of the factors.
Just to add a little bit to that, I think in more of a general sense, I think that opportunity to tell a story that's not being focused on was something that always gets us interested. And I think when we really started digging into this story, it was a totally different landscape. So the conversations that are being had now, and I'm sure we'll get to more of that, but no one was really paying attention to what had happened with Godfred. And when Calgary was racking up these terrible statistics of being the city that had the most police shootings of any city in Canada, despite not being the largest police force or anything like that, no one was really paying much attention. So there was all types of conflicts with the police, but that issue was being quite neglected, and there wasn't the same focus. So for us, it also felt like it was important to shine a light on this thing that was really important, but that no one was really paying attention to. And we've seen how much has changed since then, and I'm sure we'll talk more about that.
I think that leads into my next question. This documentary took 5 years to make. That was, I assume, 5 or 6 years ago. So much has changed, especially in the last year. I think maybe as a two-part question, do you think that the progress that has been made is hopeful? And after living with this story for 5 years, do you see the benefits already to the increased attention that these sorts of stories are getting? And are you hopeful for the future? I mean, we're recording this the day after George Floyd's murderer was found guilty. Having lived with the story for so long, are you hopeful that stories like yours in cities like Calgary and across the Canada and the world will have more hopeful outcomes? Of course, the most hopeful outcome is that these sorts of atrocities stop happening, but
you hit the nail on the head. I think everyone will be aware of just how different the conversation is, especially in this country now, And, when we first met Godfred, which was mid 2015, like it's a different world. I mean, let alone a year ago, so I think that, this sort of everything that's happened in terms of the movement and the protests and awareness, I do think, there is a dialogue going on and awareness and an engagement with these issues that just, again, especially in Canada, did not at all exist prior to this. You look at a place like Calgary, there just had not been any substantive, there are, and we see at the end of the film in the epilogue, there's thousands of people gathering to protest and make their voices heard. So it is a very different time. And I think we can't, the problems are just as severe as they were, and they're not being solved. They won't be solved overnight, but surely the engagement and, broadly speaking, with the public, the kind of pressure on institutions and the initial responses, there are some, positive signs across the country and, in Calgary and elsewhere. Again, it's a very long way away, but I think we can't help but be optimistic that, again, these very serious issues are at least now being discussed in a way that this was almost, like a minor academic sideline at best before a few small, activists.
I think a lot of the progress that we're seeing, it's really incremental, and we have to be vigilant that we don't move on so quickly from these issues and say, like, problem solved. We've seen some positive outcomes in Calgary. We've seen the new police chief have a very different kind of approach to some of his predecessors. Roger Chaffin was also trying to push things in the right direction. But again, that progress is very incremental. And because it's an institution that has a lot of pre-existing structures and biases and just, everything that comes with being an institution, policing, it takes a very long and persistent effort to change those negative aspects. But I think there are some signs of hope. I think we have other models to look at, and we know what doesn't work, certainly. So I think it's high time we try new things. Recently, we have heard the good news that Calgary is increasing the mental health response team quite a bit. I don't think that change goes far enough, but it is certainly a step in the right direction that they're allocating more resources to responding with a mental health professional and a police officer, and not just always sending 2 cops out with guns to every mental health call. That's a good change. And I'm hopeful that will help individuals not have bad ends. But I think the biggest thing is just the awareness that when Canadians pay attention to issues like this, they can actually change. And if you look back, so many of these situations, the police used to be just rampantly corrupt in most cities, 60, 70 years ago, even 50 years ago. That corruption has changed, and there is definitely still corruption, and you see it in the charges that come out of different cities. But our expectations of how the police behave have changed, and I think they will continue to change. And I'm hopeful that with the right attention to this issue, we can make that incremental progress. It's just not going to happen overnight.
Sure. Specifically for Calgary, how much of this is driven by the politics and how much is driven by the culture? And I'll elaborate. Calgary has they've had a feather in their cap for a while now with a very perceived to be a very progressive mayor who's just recently announced that he's not seeking another term. And then, as you say, the previous police chief and the current police chief both were pushing the department in more of a progressive way. And yet these sorts of incidents continue to occur. As you're documenting them, how much of it seems dug in, and how much can more progressive voices at those higher level political positions really force and make a change? And is, with the potential for a new mayor for the first time in 15 years, Calgary potentially at a turning point?
I can take a stab at that first. I think I don't think a mayor can do that much. I think you can be the progressive mayor on earth, and you can come in and be ground down by the system and the structure that's already in place. And one of the, I think this is well documented at this point, one of the impediments to change with police frequently across North America is police unions. And they sometimes, as in Calgary, they take quite a reactionary stance to any suggestion that there could be progress on these issues. And they're very, very defensive and very vested in making sure that a lot of those changes that would mean more accountability and potentially jail time or just, loss of overtime hours or whatever the punishment would be for an offense, they fight against those changes really hard. And the power that they exert on our politicians, it can't be overstated. People do really rely on the police day to day, and when the police are threatening strikes and work stoppages of different kinds, that puts politicians in an awkward place. And so there's always that delicate balancing act between what do people actually want, and then how do we actually get our police union to agree to some of these things. And I think the only way you get that is really public pressure. That's the only way you can actually get the police unions to let go of some of this power. I mean, that's an ongoing problem that I think most jurisdictions in North America have to deal with, is how do we get back the power to make decisions from these police unions, because it's clearly impeding change.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different factors. I think that, yeah, I mean, on the one hand, you can focus on the sort of fiscal side of things, and people have made very compelling arguments that police are this is not a Calgary. This is pretty much across the board. Usually the largest line item on any municipal budget. And many ways in which that money could be spent differently and quite possibly more efficaciously. So with better outcomes for public safety and the whole gamut, and I think that for a lot of people, I mean, those are compelling arguments, and I do think it's part of the picture. I think, I think, it's and we see sort of some of this in the film with Jen Magnus, with Sheila Ball. I think that the sort of the toxic culture, those types of issues, I think are really important as well, because I think that even for folks that are on your more, reactionary back to blue side, I mean, I suppose somebody can always dismiss, I mean, that's always a thing, but I mean, I think that those are those make very powerful points. And I do think I would like to think there's a growing sort of chorus from within police departments, and more voices are speaking out about these issues. I mean, just the RCMP, for example, across the country, I mean, it's just been really, and now into the military, I mean, these are all sort of part and parcel of the same problems. I mean, there are a number of things, and it's different from province to province, where you have issues in Alberta where you sort of have, there's a lot of like kicking the can, so to speak, where the police department says, oh, well, we'd love to do this, but really that's the province, and the province, and the city, and where's the money coming from? So there's a lot of that, that kind of stuff. I think there's really obvious things that I think are pending or in the works in terms of, say, increasing or we don't get into this so much in the film, but the need to like professionalize policing, right? A lot of people have pointed out, and this is common against, across the country, where, you basically need a high school degree and then less than, around 6 months, even less than 6 months of training. And this, really this is, to be a social worker or something, you are talking post-secondary degrees. Like, so there's some, I think, very obvious directions that we can go in, and that's really more of a broader federal and or provincial, issue. And I think there is, I mean, there's a lot of points there, but so it's more than, one of the things that we've seen, or we've sort of tried to start calling attention to, and this is in the context of Calgary, is, say, the Calgary Police Commission, which is the oversight body. And we see some of that meeting footage in the film, where you sort of have, the police executive lined up, and then you have the commissioners, which are, usually there's a couple city councilors, so that's, like, we found very striking attending those meetings, that you would have the public question period, or which is a specific opportunity for members of the public to get up, voice concerns, whatever it is. Like, this is your opportunity for public engagement with the police department, and there would be whole meetings where there wouldn't be a single person, or maybe there's one person there. Now, is that because there isn't in a city of 1.3 million people, people that have things to say? No, it's because clearly like there isn't the awareness, there isn't that kind of engagement. So I think, there's a lot of opportunities to put pressure on the different elements of the system. And I would say in Calgary, the Calgary Police Commission having public engaging with the police commission, and the police commission feeling far more, pressure to, then communicate those or oversee the kind of the changes and what's being called for. I mean, that is another kind of thing that I think hopefully we'll see, we'll see more of.
Just to pick up quickly, I mean, the police commission is supposed to be the body that holds the police to account in some ways directly from the public, because they're the representatives of the public of Calgary. And when no one's at those meetings making complaints and not saying, I'm from this part of the city and we're seeing these problems, their job sort of withers, and they don't really ask the tough questions, because they just sort of, they go through the meetings, they rubber stamp things, they ask the odd question and make the odd point, but it doesn't really amount to meaningful accountability. And so if you could change that conversation, I mean, the dynamic exists already for them to try to hold the police accountable. But what we see frequently is that there isn't really much will to do that, because there isn't this sort of constant pressure from the public telling them directly at the meetings and saying, what are you folks doing here? Police commission, where is the change that we're looking for in the community on the ground? And that, I think, dynamic could really shift quite quickly. And those structures exist across the country, as far as I know.
Right. And I think we can all agree, and we see a lot of sort of aspects of this in the film, and we can talk a little bit about how this is continuing to play out. But accountability in the most basic sense, in terms of criminal and civil accountability for malfeasance. Like you said, just yesterday, we had the the ruling in the Floyd trial, or in the Chauvin trial, and I think that I think the double standards that we've seen in terms of the charging, the prosecution of police, and there's many different stages here. Just talking about in Calgary and in Canada, I think that they have a very, very, very negative impact. I strongly believe that the ripple effects of officers, we need a few examples of officers actually being held accountable, like the potential, like if we had an officer in this country, and we see in the film, the Heffernan, I mean, that was, as far as we know, almost as close as, that we've gotten in Alberta to really, seeing charges for, and who knows how that trial would have gone out had it happened. I mean, I would like to think that, officers will be thinking very differently, and not just them as individuals, but their their superiors, and then the whole system, about how they're behaving if they actually think that there might be a serious criminal consequence, at the end of that. It's interesting, so just an update for the audience, actually starting on Monday will be the sentencing hearing in the Lindsay trial related to the Haworth incident, the trial that we follow in the film. So in the film, it sort of ends with the guilty verdict. Okay. And that was spring 2019. Okay. So here we are two years later, and we still haven't gotten to the sentencing hearing. Now, perhaps some of that delay could be attributed to COVID, and it's a complicated case. And, and the truth is too, there's just not a lot of precedence in terms of how to prosecute police officers, what the sentence should be. And that's why, we're expecting, apparently it's going to be at least sort of 6 days of court for the sentencing hearing. This is very unusual. So we'll see how that turns out. But again, and just to reemphasize, we had here the toxic or the damaging nature of, you have your Godfrey incident, end of 2013, no consequences for the officers involved. Year and a half later, Lindsay abuses somebody else with the consequences that we see in the film. Takes, a year and a half, and the whole timeline here, that was spring 2015 to 2019. So 4 years for that to go to trial. I mean, that is, our understanding is that's roughly 3 times what it usually would take for, we could see, for example, Godfrey, that was a year and a half. So this is extraordinary, the amount, and we really have to ask these questions, why that is, and it's not clear, nobody's, they're just, whatever's going on, it's there is a whole different process, and it's, justice delayed is justice denied. It's really damaging, I think. So
I actually want to pick that up, because it's something I've been thinking a lot about, because what's going on in the Canadian system that we have these outcomes? Because 6 years later, we're going to get this sentencing hearing. 6 years after the incident occurred, okay? The sentencing hearing. So what happens after the sentencing hearing? He's going to appeal. I mean, that's almost guaranteed. So he's going to appeal. So while he's waiting for his appeal to make its way through the courts, what's he doing? He's living his life. He's out free. So even if he gets a harsh sentence, like while the appeal is underway, it's not as though he gets put into jail unless the judge is going to suddenly take away his bail or something. Like this is very unlikely. So what we've seen in the past with officers, even once they've been found guilty, which is very rare, in the case of the Prince incident, we saw, that officer was found guilty, was sentenced to 90 days. He appealed that for a few years. So then he only finally started doing his sentence a couple years after that guilty verdict came down. So, are we looking at another 2 years before this guy sees the inside of a jail cell or whatever punishment is handed down for this incident that happened in 2015? I mean, it's a little bit bewildering to think that's how slow it is with police officers. And our court system is slow with everyone, but we really feel that there is a bit of dragging the heels and really allowing the process to unfold. And part of that is that a lot of the litigation is funded. Right. So when you have bottomless coffers to defend yourself, then everything takes a lot longer. Yeah. Whereas if you're just some, Joe Nobody on the street and you get hit with these big charges, they process them quickly and, you're going to be doing your sentence pretty quickly.
I'm interested, the police unions go to such extents to protect their members when they're being accused of things. Does that protection extend once they're actually in court? Like how loyal is the union to their members even up to the trial? Did you get a sense of that?
So I think it would vary from from one jurisdiction to the next, but generally speaking, so in the context of Calgary, and this is an issue that, for example, like we don't really get into in the film, but we think that the public would very much, should be more aware of, is the fact that, for example, so it's, they're technically employees of the city. So it's the city of Calgary that covers the legal fees straight up through the end of, depending on how the trial ends up, but through the end of the sort of the base part of the trial, i.e. through the end of conviction and then sentencing. So, and then so that's sort of the obligation in terms of the city. At that point in time, if say you're found guilty, as in the case of Lindsay, and he appeals, if the appeal is successful, still the city will cover the costs. If not, again, it's hard to get, there isn't a lot of transparency, but our presumption, our understanding is that generally speaking, then it's the union footing the bill, which is, for example, what, in the beginning of the film, we see the Clayton Prince incident, in that case, Othan with his several appeals, none of which were successful. We would presume, but we don't know for sure that it's the union paying those bills. And there is also, it's, I don't know what the difference is in terms of disclosing these type of things from, say, a teachers union or the police union or whatever, but there is a serious lack of transparency and not a lot of desire from what we've seen from the Calgary Police Association, which is the union, to engage with questions from the media. There's a lot of sort of hostility there. But it is, I think that if, litigation is really, really expensive. Going to court, we see, Don, like the Don McLeod who's representing Lindsay in the film. This is one of the, sort of great, defense attorneys in Calgary. Certainly one of the most expensive, is our understanding. These are not cheap proceedings. So I think if individuals were having to foot the bill themselves, it might be a very different story. So yeah, I do think that's a factor. And I think, like, you look at Calgary, the curve in terms of the expenditure that the city has been responsible for of legal fees for the Calgary. So there are legal fees covered internally, but in terms of these costs of, say, settlements and such, that curve is just, like a hockey stick is describing it, it's exponential. And, that might also be, like I said, we didn't get to this in the film, but this also might be a good way for the public or other, documentarians or whatever to put pressure on the system, broadly speaking, to address some of these issues. I think the public, if it was more aware of how much this is costing them, I think would find it very disturbing.
Yeah.
Yeah, we foot the bill for for pretty much everything when it concerns the police. And I think the part of my, people who are really pro police and back the blue, and they should also understand, I think, that this is taking money away from training, from even from the police budget themselves, right? So you're actually creating a less safe situation when you're forced to do payouts for bad behavior, when you're forced to defend police officers who are acting violent on the job unnecessarily, which I very much think is the case in Calgary multiple times. When you're causing all this unnecessary time in court, we all pay for that, and it's not good for anyone. It's essentially wasted money, and this is without even touching the fact that you're permanently damaging so many members of the public, breaking that trust with the community. And those things have ripple effects. When you're trying to investigate crimes and you're going to the same communities and saying like, hey, we want to talk to X, Y, and Z. Will you talk to us? Well, people say, no, man, I don't trust the police. And so this happens all the time. And I think that, that those corrosive effects are really, we don't get into those sort of community level effects. We just didn't have time to cover that in the film, but we've seen that played out in cities again and again. And the very people who suffer at the hands of the police sometimes are the ones who then suffer again when their communities can't get justice for crimes that are committed in them,
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's like, it's funny. There's so many ways in which there are so many things that have disturbed us over the years that we've been working on this project. Just one very simple one, I think that folks across the country, certainly Ontario, would find very similar issues, is to do with the policies of, say, the provincial Crown Prosecution Service around judicial criticism. So what is that? So basically a judge criticizing the testimony of someone, and obviously we're concerned in this case with police officers. So in the case of Godfred's trial, there was very serious judicial criticism of the reliability of the integrity, essentially, of the officers who testified. What was the result of that? What was the consequence? Is there some, you would like to think, surely there must be some system that kicks in where the Crown prosecutor has the obligation to follow up on that. There's something, we are not aware of any sort of cogent policy that says, when you hear a judge say this, X, happens as a result. I mean, and if there is sort of there's talk of a list, an informal list or something that's maintained by the Crown. I mean, this is not a publicly available list. And again, there doesn't seem to be any sort of systematic approach to it. So that to me is very disturbing. And we've seen we've had a lot of these experiences where, we sort of figure like, this is a society in which things are functioning, with reasonable efficiency, and there are, sufficient safeguards. And time again, we've just seen, those safeguards that we would hope, to exist. It's just, they're just oftentimes not there. Or if they are there, they're not at all sufficient. So
I'll just point out that, just recently, I think in New York, in Brooklyn, there was 90, they're trying to overturn 90 convictions from one police officer because he was found to be perjuring himself. We should be seeing similar things in Canada from time to time, but because there isn't a cogent policy that says when an officer lies on the stand, you must investigate previous cases and make sure that, you're not putting people away on false testimony. This is a serious problem, right? If you're that person who's gotten time and a criminal record based on some officer's testimony, and they lied, and they've been shown to lie in a court of law, and the judge has said as much, where's the follow-up, right? Where's the discipline? Where's the ensuring that this doesn't keep happening? Where's the consequences for officers who lie on the stand? It's unclear that there's any motivation on the behalf of the justice system to hold officers to that kind of account. And I think it's just been totally an issue that we as a society have figured, somebody's taking care of it. But the truth is, no one is. I think actually another thing that feeds into this is that Canadians don't know much about, your average Canadian, certainly I am part of this group, and ever seen the inside of a courtroom? We don't see these images on TV. We don't hear the recording from court. And that's part of, to protect, sort of the integrity, and the Supreme Court has said as much that, certain images shouldn't be allowed. But the effect of that is that people really don't know what's going on inside courtrooms. And I think that's actually, in many ways, a very bad thing.
Canadians also lack the kind of cultural touchstones that Americans do, law and order, taught everybody in the States how their judicial system works roughly. There, except if you're looking at street legal back in the 80s, there isn't really the Canadian equivalent. But to that point, I think the first time I saw the inside of a courtroom was when I got called for jury duty once. And it was, that is the extent of the time that I have spent inside a courtroom or have any understanding of it. So.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And even, even us growing up, I mean, I remember seeing the OJ trial on TV. I didn't quite understand it at the time, but people get a sense of how the procedures of court work, but it's all knowledge from south of the border. Like, we don't actually know how a Canadian judge behaves most of the time, or, certainly not near local jurisdiction. And I think that, it's probably a bad thing. Spending a little bit more time understanding what goes on in a court of law, I think, would help Canadians see a lot of the flaws in their justice system, and would help us, I think, hold, for example, our prosecutors to account, which is something that there isn't really a mechanism for that in Canada. They're not elected, they're appointed. Who are these people? They don't have to sort of present themselves to us and say, I'm going to defend your interests. They just get appointed. And when they make decisions, like in the Heffernan case, not to prosecute, that's it. And so the officers who may have been held to account in that situation are not going to be held to account because the prosecutor said so. And when the Heffernans tried to go in front of a judge and say that decision was incorrect, the judge said, it's not on me to micromanage the prosecutors, because that's how the law in Canada is written. So where is the oversight when we know how closely police work with prosecutors? Right. Where is the opportunity to actually hold police officers to account? And I think that kind of vacuum really is disturbing. And you have a body like ACERT, which is set up, but where's the independence for ACERT? Because ACERT won't even bother charging an officer if the Crown's not going to follow through. So they don't even charge. I mean, so where's the independence really? If ACERT knows that they're not going to charge, then they don't even bring the charges for it. So, I mean, it just ends up with officers walking free who really should be facing serious consequences, I think.
Right. And even like in the film at one point when they're trying to move jurisdictions, I think they tried to move it up to Edmonton, you just run into the same things. Sure, the people are up there don't maybe have a personal connection to it, but it's the same systems in place and the same blocks in the way.
Well, that's, and so some of that, like the audio that we hear in the film, that's of a meeting that the Heffernans had with ACERT. I mean, this has never been released before. And we're just getting part of it in the film, but it's incredibly damning. I mean, this discussion, this acknowledgement from Susan Houston, the head of ACERT, that says, well, essentially, I'm considering, like, I'm going to talk to Eric Tolpanen, who we see as as the head of the Crown, but whether or not we should send this out of province, and we're not aware of, like, well, what happened to that discussion, and because even if, like, it's like the whole thing, the court system, it's like the appearance of objectivity, the appearance of, like, if she was concerned enough to voice that at the time, like, that to me is, like, in and of itself, is just like, well, it's really, and in the end, you have a, in the case of, for example, the Lindsay trial, sure, it's a Crown and it's a judge who's coming from Edmonton, so there's some slight distinction there, but it's really,
but it's also not a potential murder charge.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? Like, that's a totally different thing than somebody who's than aggravated assault, which is, again, also a very serious charge, and kudos to everyone involved for, like, at least bringing those charges and following through with the prosecution. But a potential murder charge, that's a very sort of frightening prospect, I think, for the prosecutors involved when you're dealing with all these unions and the potential backlash, and how is this going to affect our relationships going forward? This is why you would bring it to a prosecutor from Manitoba, so that they wouldn't ever have to interact with those people in the system. And Eric Tolpanen is a judge now, okay? In the middle of a totally unrelated scandal involving his department, he was the Conservative government in Alberta appointed him as a judge. Got frozen video here.
There also.
Oh, I think we're back now.
Okay, there was a bit of a lag there.
Yeah.
But anyhow, I mean, so you have the situation where prosecutors end up as judges, and the same police officers, and there's the same individuals are working within this system, many of them for entire careers. And so the impetus to not cross police unions, officers who are high ranking, police chiefs, et cetera, is pretty high.
Right.
And so you would think you would make a concerted effort to make sure that there would be no even appearance of impropriety. And that just, again, there seems to be no appetite for that as a movement in Alberta, certainly.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we'll start to wrap up here a little bit. I have another question about kind of your position as filmmakers. When a filmmaker is making a narrative film, there's a constructed conclusion to their picture. But as documentarians, you're dealing with real life stories. There are not necessarily neat and tidy endings. After living with a story like this for 5 years, how do you make the decision that this is where we're going to stop telling the story? Even if the story continues, how do you decide this is where we're going to break it and let it continue on its own?
Well, I think it helps when you have a contract to deliver a film to CBC. So for those who aren't aware, a much shorter version, the film was officially commissioned or originally commissioned by CBC POV, which is sort of the sister strand to the nature of things. So that, we delivered that film, it was set to broadcast almost exactly a year ago. It was delayed until July because of COVID, but that certainly was a major factor. Our last shoot was in fall 2019. Yep. But it's, that is a really tough question. And I think especially with this type of issue where there's so much ongoing, it's a challenge. And for example, with No Visible Trauma, like the epilogue we see of Godfred at the vigil at the big BLM event there, that was something that we did in fact, go back and kind of add in after the fact. It's tough. It is a tough question. I think that we felt though with the stories, we'd gotten to, kind of a point with each of them where, there's sort of, there's a lot left hanging that obviously we're not in control of, but there is also certain conclusions. But yeah, it is a messy business. It's not, like you said, writing a fiction film where you can just tie it all up in a neat little package. So it is, there's a number of factors. In our case, that delivery, did help. And I think also I would say with something that's very topical like this, even before George Floyd and the uprising, I think we were feeling a tremendous amount of pressure, to get the film out there. With Godfred's story, for example, the rest of all of the stories, but really Godfred's story, for example, there had been virtually no attention of any sort on at all. And the same thing with the Heffernan story, that had more attention, but we really did, I think, feel as documentarians, a strong onus to get the stories out there and not, muck around for years, sort of waiting on that perfect time. But it's a tough.
When you have court decisions and sort of the bureaucracy in the background, it's hard to, things can get delayed so quickly and for so many weeks and so many months that if you're trying to plan around a set date that they've given you, good luck. We had that happen multiple times where, X thing was supposed to happen at X time, this is the hearing, and it just gets moved. Certainly with the sentencing hearing here that's happening shortly, that's been moved many times. And you just have to, at some point you just have to say, let's get it out there.
Yeah. But if folks, we're not, I would say we are reluctant practitioners of the social media realm, but we do try really not just to sort of promote the film and where it's screening, but to share updates about what's going on with the stories, and then more broadly speaking about policing in Alberta, but across the country. So we're at Above the Law Doc on Instagram and Facebook, and then Lost Time Media on Twitter for folks who are interested in sort of keeping up with developments, including we're actually in the process of a lawsuit. We're being sued by one of the officers that appears very briefly early in the film, and there is a whole connection there. We believe in terms of, we didn't get to it earlier, but with the police union and that kind of stuff. So if people are interested in knowing more, you can check us out there. It really is like with so many of the issues that we touch on in the film. We're really scraping the surface here. There's there's a huge breadth of problems, and we always emphasize none of what you see in the film is sort of particular to Calgary. I would imagine that you can find essentially a lot of the same issues across the country, and so I think there's a lot of opportunity for the public in many different ways to get engaged with these issues, and we hope that more and more people will do so.
Terrific. I think my last question is, if you're able to say, what are you working on now?
Yeah, we are producing a feature film called Love in the Time of Fentanyl, and we're working on that with our good friend Colin Askey. It's a film set in the downtown East Side, where he spent many years working and being part of that
Vancouver,
community.
the downtown East Side.
The downtown East Side in Vancouver. Having lived there, I guess I still have that mentality of like, everyone knows what the downtown East Side is. Downtown East Side of Vancouver. Thank you, Mark. And it is, it follows a sort of a group of people who operate what at the time was a renegade safe injection site, and is look at the crisis there, which is unfortunately very much ongoing and across the country and across North America, unfortunately, and COVID has in many ways exacerbated it, unfortunately.
It's certainly a conversation that is happening and ongoing here in the region of Waterloo. So we look forward to seeing it, and hopefully we'll be able to bring it to GRFF when you're done.
Absolutely.
So yeah.
Okay, Robinder, Mark, thank you so much for taking the time. It was wonderful talking with you, and thank you for a terrific film.
Thank you so much for having us, Michael.
Thank you.